Hi everyone, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name's Paul Bates, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this seminar this afternoon, where we're going to be talking about Fathom's new US flood map. I've got with me Anna Walton, who's helping run our Q&A and the chat, and also Dr. Matthew Jones, who's Fathom's Chief Product Officer. So next slide, please, Matt. So we're going to be talking to you today. Matt and I are going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for a good lot of questions and answers, and we're happy to sit here and address as many of those as we can in the hour that we've got. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction and then talk about the background to our new US flood map, the work we've done in the US and how we've got here. And then I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's going to give an overview of the product and talk about a few of the use cases for it. We'll also talk about how to access and Q&A at the end. We normally have lots of questions to get through. If we don't manage to get through them all, we will get back to you after the meeting and try and email you an answer to whatever question you posted. So don't feel shy about putting things into the Q&A. We will get back to you and answer all the questions. So what about Fathom? What can we tell you about that? Well, we formed out of my research group at the University of Bristol. I've been at the university. I joined as a lecturer in 1995, and for many years I've run a research group there looking at flood inundation modelling in various aspects. Fathom formed out of that team and initially was mostly staffed by people from my research group, postdocs and PhD students. So many of the people that whose names you see on our papers will have been trained through my research group. So we're co-founded by a team of hopefully world-leading scientists, and our aim is really to provide comprehensive water risk intelligence for the entire planet. And as you might expect, having come out of a university, research has always been a critically important part of our company development. We are scientists at heart, but we're trying to use that science to make products and data sets that then have real impact on people and businesses. Okay, next slide, please, Matt. So if I was going to characterize our kind of ethos, it'd probably be in these four things. Why think about working with Fathom? And the most important thing is integrity and openness. Being scientists, we want to publish all our methods in open access, peer-reviewed journals, and because of that, you know that our methods have been independently peer-reviewed and validated. It's also the case that lots of our papers are very highly cited. They're quite influential in the field, and then that also gives some confidence that other people also think that the kinds of things we do are a good idea. If you're going to publish cutting-edge science, you'd better make sure that your research is right at the forefront, and that's what we try to do, because you don't get journal publications for repeating things that other people have done. A couple of latest things that we've worked on are different ways to build river channels and river bathymetry into models, and also we've been working a lot recently on trying to make the world's best global open bearer terrain data set. That's a product we call FabDem, and we're just about to release a new version of that, FabDem Plus, in the next month or two. We've also got a fantastic new approach to climate dynamics, where we take the CMIP6 model outputs and use those to come up with change factors for pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding, so sea level rise. And also to use that climate dynamics approach to try and look at uncertainty, because we know that the different climate models give us a spread of future scenarios for what might happen, and ideally decision-making to take those into account. And then there's also ways to access our data, which Matt will talk about later on, but there's a few there on the screen. Okay, next slide, please. And this is the slide that makes me feel old, because this is a kind of a list of our key papers going back to 1992, which is the first paper I published in my PhD as a first-year PhD student. So this is the very first one that came out, right up to one I published earlier this year, 2023, which is a climate conditioned catastrophe model for the UK. And these are some of the nice ones in the intervening period, but in between 92 and 2003, I've published about 270 papers in peer-reviewed journals. When you factor in all the papers that Fathom Fathomers have published where I'm not involved, then the number of outputs that have come out of this team is racking up into the 300s or even into the 400s. So we're pretty good at flood inundation modeling, and we've got a long pedigree and track record at doing this. And then that's what we're going to continue to do into the future. Next slide, please. So now, what about a new US flood map? Well, we've got some experience of modeling in the US already, so we'll talk about that now. So next slide, please, Matt. You know, our first attempts at building a bespoke model of the US were in the late 2010s. And there's a very nice paper here down in the bottom left corner of this slide by Ollie Wing, one of my former PhD students, who talks about our first attempts at modeling flooding in the US. And what we did is used our set of algorithms and methods with the very high quality data that we have in the US to build an entire model of flooding in the lower 48 states. This model replicated the FEMA maps where they existed and were of high enough quality, and it reproduced flood observations to within error. What we found when we did this is that the FEMA mapping actually has not complete coverage over the US. There's a lot of states that aren't covered. Even within states, there are river reaches which have not yet been modeled, even though the FEMA mapping program has been going since the late 1960s. And one of the interesting things we found is that when we do a comprehensive continent-wide inundation model, we see about 3 times more people actually living in the 100-year floodplain than you get if you intersect the FEMA estimates with population data sets. And this rings true with the kind of additional exposure we've seen in the US over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of flooding. There does seem to be many more people in the exposed to floods than we were previously aware of. Next slide, please. So more recently, we've been doing some statewide mapping for the Texas Water Development Board. Now, the context here is that quite a large proportion of Texas, 63%, is unmapped when it comes to flood. This diagram here shows what the Texans call the floodplain quilt. So these are the types of mapping available in different parts of the state. And the non-grey colours indicate the different sorts of base level elevation mapping that has been done. And you can see that there's a limited coverage. But there's lots of decisions that need to be taken where you'd need flood maps everywhere. But going about it, you know, it's taken quite a long time to get the Texan flood map to this point. And actually getting complete coverage with existing approaches was going to take an awful long time. Texas has set aside $45 million for base level flood estimates. But that's not going to happen on the kind of timescales that they wanted. So that's where Fathom came in. So we've developed a new complete Texas terrain model for the project. Next slide, please. And then we've used that to fill in the gaps and build a complete statewide flood map for Texas. And that's given us a significant improvement in understanding flood risk. So here you see in light blue, the existing Texan state map, and then in dark blue, the areas of additional flood risk that Fathom's been able to fill in. Now, this is not a replacement for doing things, you know, reach by reach in a thorough engineering way, but we were able to do this whole project within 6 months and provide at least a baseline coverage for the state of Texas that allows you then to triage by risk in terms of which sites therefore need the most attention for more bespoke modeling commissioning projects. Next slide, please. So we're not new to building national scale models in the US, but you know, over time and actually very rapidly in this field, the source data and methods are progressing really, really quickly. So we felt in the last 18 months that the time had come to do a new ground up model build in the US. So to go back to the drawing board, start again, improve all the data sets and the methods, and build a new US flood map. This is an extension of our new global flood map, which was released a few months back. And we're using that new architecture to leverage the data-rich nature of the US to produce a new coverage with better skill and better resolution. Exactly how we do that is explained in what's called the product stack on the Fathom's website, and there's a fantastic animation there that my colleague Holly Taylor has put together, which explains exactly how our methods work. And you can drill into that in detail if you want to get through to the academic papers that underpin all this. So ground-up model build, there's new terrain data at 10-meter resolution. We're covering all major flood perils. We have this climate dynamics framework that allows us to do any climate options and multiple emission scenarios. We've upgraded all to the latest observation data, and most significantly, we've improved the terrain data enormously. I say we, the US has improved its terrain data enormously. You know, if we'll see some slides in a moment, but you know, the amount of coverage has really gone up, and we're harnessing that as well. And we've been able to build in our latest science to the model as well. So there's just three things I draw your attention to that I'm particularly excited about. So next slide, please. First is the channel solver. And this is a paper that my colleague Jeff Neal published in Water Resources Research back in 2021. And this is really neat because over the entire US, channel bathymetry is essentially unknown. Well, you know, we can get channel widths, and there's a bunch of different data products where you can observe channel widths across the US. We can have channel center lines from the NHD plus data set, but we don't have the depths. And that's unobservable by remote sensing, and there's no benchmark data on that at all. So instead, what we do is we have to estimate the size of channels everywhere across the US river network. And the channel solver approach in this paper is the method we use to do that. So we estimate the channel geometries based on making them consistent with our extreme flow estimates, and we dynamically link those two methods. We know there are some biases in the extreme flow estimates because gauging stations have inaccuracies and are not can have short records. We know that our estimates of channel geometry are exactly that, they're estimates. And if those two estimates mismatch, you either get channels that are too big or too small, and either flood too much or flood not enough. So part of the approach is using gradually varied flow hydrodynamic methods to estimate the size of channel that would be necessary to convey the flows that you estimate for that particular site. And it's a really neat approach that leads to consistent modeling. Next slide, please. A second thing I'm really excited about, because another one of my PhD students, Gang Zhao, published a paper on this in Water Resources Research, is how we take dams into account. Now, obviously, dams, if they break, cause large-scale flooding downstream, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Here I'm considering the impact of dam structures on reducing the magnitude of the T-year flood downstream of the dam. By the T-year, I mean the return period. So what we do is we take information about the dam from the GRAND database, which is available globally, and we use a machine learning approach based on USGS gauge data and the GRAND information to estimate these things called dam reduction factors. This is the amount that a particular return period flow is decreased downstream of a dam, given its characteristics in the GRAND database. And these methods work extremely well. And you can see here the reduction in flood extent that you get if you take that into account. So this is downstream of Lake Houston in Texas on the San Jacinto River. This is the 1 in 100-year fluvial layers without consideration of the dam that you see in the north of the picture. Here you can see that very straight line, which is the dam wall. If we flip to the next slide, that's the reduction that you get when you take the dam reduction factor into account. 1 in 100-year flows downstream of dams of this size are smaller than if the dam were not there at all, because it has a flood protection effect. And these dam reduction factors take that into account in a physically meaningful way. Okay, next slide, please. And then the last thing that's really important in the new version of the model is the terrain coverage. And the US has been going crazy for LiDAR data. It's fantastic. A good job here. We've known for a long time that hydrodynamic models are strongly dependent on the quality of the terrain data that goes in. And it's always been a source of frustration that, you know, a decade ago, there's relatively little of this in the US, but really the coverage has been extending super fast. So this is the LiDAR that we were incorporated in our 2020 model, and it's not too bad. But if we go to the next slide, this is the LiDAR coverage in 2023. This is almost twice as much LiDAR coverage in the US over a 3-year period. I mean, and if you're a flood modeler, this is just fantastic news. More importantly, the LiDAR has been collected predominantly where the people are. And because we're interested in flood risk, where the assets are is the most important thing. So in the new data set, 94% of buildings in the lower 48 are covered by a LiDAR. And that's up from 58% in 2020. And that's just marvelous. So we've still got chunks of the West that don't have any LiDAR coverage at all. Go to the next slide, please. So we have lots of places where there's new LiDAR, and there's lots of places where the LiDAR has been updated since the old data set that existed there in 2020. So lots of places have been done twice, and we're using, of course, the latest data product. And then next slide, please. Where LiDAR data doesn't exist, we're filling in with our Fathom product, because we think that's the best planetary coverage bare Earth DEM that we can use at the moment. And it's a reprocessing of the Copernicus DEM. And there's a nice paper by my colleague Lawrence Hawker in Environmental Research Letters, which describes it. But stitching all these things together gives us what we think is the best view of US bare Earth terrain. Okay, next slide, please. So that's all I want to say in terms of background to Fathom and the US flood map. I'll now hand over to my colleague Matt, who'll talk us through the products themselves and how to access them. So thanks very much for listening, and over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Paul. Hi, everyone. Anna, just a request for you to enable me to start my video, please. In the meantime, while my video is getting ready, you've heard from Paul about Fathom and the extensive science that underpins everything we do. And indeed, some of the new and cutting edge techniques that the US flood map is based on. I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about the product itself, so what the US flood map data comprises. I'm going to talk about use cases and also how to access the data, and then we'll take some questions. So hopefully this slide explains what you can license. There's a lot on it, so I'll take a little bit of time going through it. There's basically 2 sets of metrics that you can license that comprise, if you like, the US flood map. There's flood hazard, so that's depths by return period, and there's risk scores, relative risk and risk category, and I'll go through both of those in a second. I think something I want to emphasize now is that the resolution of the US flood map is at 1/3 arc-second. So that's nominally a 10-meter resolution. Actually, at the latitudes of the United States, it's a bit better than 10-meter horizontal resolution. So quite a fine grid across the coterminous US, but also Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the more populated areas of Alaska are included in this product. Now, Paul mentioned climate dynamics. That's a very flexible climate framework, and I'll cover that a bit later on in this section. The thing I want to mention on this slide is that even if you're not interested in future climate options, a lot of work through the climate dynamics framework has gone into our current view of risk to make sure it represents the current level of climate forcing. So what we're not doing is just looking at historical data and assuming we don't need to make any adjustments to that. When we present a 2020 or whatever year you want from our flood maps, that view of risk is geared towards the relevant level of climate forcing using our climate dynamics framework. So that's important even if you don't really care about future climate risk, if you care about the current risk. So in terms of flood hazard and risk scores, I'm going to go through flood hazard now. I'm actually going to come back to risk scores in a few minutes' time. But I wanted to put it up here to show that we have 2 main sets of metrics. So flood hazard, what we mean by that in the context of the US flood map and indeed our global flood map, inundation depths, so flood depths by return period, anywhere between 5 and 1,000 years. So we have 8 standard return periods we produce, but actually the sort of flexibility we have in our climate dynamics framework, we also have when it comes to return periods. You can pick any return period you want within 5-year to 1,000-year range, and we can produce maps of flood depth for that particular return period. Now you can see here the dimensionality of the data is quite large. If you look at that type box there, you've got a number of different options in there. So 3 main perils, so fluvial, which is river flooding, pluvial, which is surface water flooding, flash flooding, and coastal, which is a combined impact of surge and tides and waves. And you can see for both fluvial flooding and for coastal flooding, there's 3 different defense options. So there's undefended, which is assuming there's no defenses anywhere. There's known defended, which is actually a new option for this US flood map. We don't have that in the global flood map. But this is where we show the benefit of defenses that we know exist. We have confidence exist. But where we don't have a lot of confidence defenses exist, we show the undefended map. So that's our known defended layers. And then there are our defended layers, which combine the benefit of areas where we know there are defenses with an assumption that's made based on the level of urbanization. So we assume defenses in areas where there aren't defenses because databases aren't complete. And the use of flood hazard data, so depth by return period data, is if you want to understand whether you're in a particular frequency zone, so are you in a 100-year flood zone or not, or if you want to know the depth of flooding of a particular frequency or set of frequencies, then obviously flood hazard data is what you need. A lot of dimensionality there, and that can be reduced in risk scores, but I'll come back to those in a few slides' time. I wanted really to just go through the defense options here because they are a little bit new for US flood map, and we think they're really important, and the different defense options lend themselves well to different types of use case. So what we're showing here is an area in Lake Jackson, Texas, and we're showing an example of an area where we know we have good information about flood defenses from the US Army Corps of Engineers National Levee Database. So this polygon is from that. It shows the area protected by the levee in this location, which has a standard of protection of 100 years. What I'm showing here in blue is the 1 in 200-year fluvial defended flood map. So that's why you can see areas within the polygon that are blue, because the 200-year flood has depths higher than the 100-year floods. So there will be overtopping in this scenario. If I'd shown you the 100-year flood map, you wouldn't see any flooding in this polygon. So an important point to note is that when the standard protection is exceeded by our maps, we show overtopping. We don't just assume the whole defense breaches. So this is, like I say, an example of where we know about flood defenses. I'm now going to show you an area where we don't know about flood defenses. So this is Palm Beach County in Florida. And this is showing in blue here the 1 in 20-year fluvial undefended map. And you can see that sort of grids pattern in the sort of middle section of the map there. I mean, it's clearly indicative of an urban area, right? So there's houses or some sort of buildings there, clearly from that grid pattern. And the undefended map shows a lot of it floods. Now, we know flood defense databases aren't complete. We think we probably have some of the best defense data in the world in the US, but even the US Army Corps of Engineers database is perhaps 1/3 complete. So for us to assume there's no defenses here would probably be wrong. Generally, defenses are built in areas where there's properties to protect. And so we give some other options around that. This shows here a 20-year fluvial defended map where we have assumed there's a defense that protects up to 20 years. So there's no flooding at 20 years now in our defended map. And this one shows if you put the 100-year fluvial map over, because it's a 20-year protection here that we've assumed, there's some overtopping, just like in the very first case I showed. So in summary, there are 3 different choices you can make for fluvial and for coastal data. Choose undefended, and the use case there is if you want to look at the worst case scenario, what could really go wrong if everything fails, use the undefended maps. Then there's the maps that represent the protection from known defenses only. And the use case there would be if you're an engineering consultancy and you can send people to a limited number of properties to check or sites to check, you probably don't want us in Fathom making assumptions, research-driven assumptions, but assumptions nonetheless, about where defenses are. You probably want to go out and check the environment and check what defenses are actually protecting those sites you've been asked to do some sort of engineering report on. So there, the known defenses only maps might be the best layers, the best data to choose. On the other hand, if you're an insurer with a big portfolio of thousands or millions of locations, there's no way you can check out every single one. What you want is an unbiased estimate of the flood risk. And there it makes sense to have an assumption because the databases are incomplete. So there probably are known defense layers, which incorporate both known defenses and assumed defenses are probably the best ones to use. So we're not adding dimensionality just to bombard you with data. We're adding dimensionality because we think there are genuine use cases that will benefit from having these options. So hopefully that's sort of given some clarity as to the different defense options we have. So risk scores, I said I'd come back to risk scores, and here we are. And we think that risk scores are a very simple but very powerful set of metrics that can be used in a number of use cases. And what they're trying to do is to synthesize a lot of the information that I spoke about in this first slide in the product section, number of different return periods, number of different perils, defended, undefended, and so on, is trying to synthesize those down to a much smaller, very powerful set of numbers. So I'll start with relative risk. And the easiest way to think about relative risk is if we take a property, a building, an arbitrary exposure really of a value of say 1 million, and we move that building around every single grid cell in the coterminous US and Puerto Rico and Hawaii and parts of Alaska, and we calculate the average annual loss or the expected annual loss. We do a calculation using all the data I've just spoken about. I won't go into the details of that calculation here. We did a webinar on this around about a month ago, actually, with Paul as well. So I'd encourage you to go and look up that webinar if you want to know more about the calculation. But essentially, we use as much information as we can and produce this number that's fairly continuous between 0 and the theoretical maximum of 1 million. And if you want a roughly linear relationship with expected loss, and you want information on risk inside the floodplain, because we need all that depth, frequency information to be able to calculate it, then relative risk is a good risk score metric for you. Actually, if you want something more categorized, so instead of 0 to 1 million, you want to score 0 to 100, and you want to look at proximate risk to the floodplain, then we have something called risk category, which we think is very useful. So what we do there is we take relative risk and we chunk up that 0 to 1 million into risk categories 6 to 100. So that's just a bidding process, a categorization process to get a fewer number of risk categories. And then what we do is we look outside the 1,000-year flood, our extreme flood, and we look at grid cells that are proximate to that extreme flood surface, so close to it, both in a horizontal sense and also in a vertical sense. How high is the land relative to that extreme flood surface? And we use that information to categorize into a 1 to 5 risk category score. So you've got then quite a nice 1 to 100 score that tells you a lot about flood risk. And the reason we do that is because we think, as you've heard from Paul, that our flood maps are state of the art. They use the latest data. There's a number of reasons for thinking they're very good, but there is always uncertainty in flood risk modeling. In fact, Paul wrote a paper on that relatively recently that was published in Nature. So if you're interested on uncertainty in flood risk modeling, I'd encourage you to look up Paul's Nature paper on that topic. But because there's uncertainty, it makes sense, we think, to tell you where we think there's that there could be risk, right? It's not within our floodplain, but there could be because it's close to our floodplain. And if you go even just 500 meters from our extreme flood, the interesting thing is you find that over 90% of US buildings will fall in risk categories 1 to 100. Risk category 0 means further than 500 meters away. Anything that non-zero means it's within 500 meters of our floodplain. So that's pretty interesting when you put that together with Paul's terrain data statistics about 94% of buildings now being covered by LiDAR data. You've got a huge amount of the property stock at risk or very close to being at risk and covered by accurate data in our flood map. And that, I think, makes it a pretty compelling product. In terms of the dimensions in which you can get risk scores, you can have fluvial, pluvial, or coastal, so scores for each of those, or we combine them. It's not just additive, it's combined in a sensible way to make sure we don't double count and stuff like that. So inland would be a combination of fluvial and pluvial, flood would be a combination of fluvial, pluvial, and coastal. And these are, of course, available in our US flood map product, but also globally. So if you have a global portfolio, you can get all the benefits of having the really good, high quality underlying LiDAR data in the US and also a consistent calculation methodology elsewhere, everything underpinned by, at worst, FabDem, which has been proven to be a very accurate DEM from independent peer-reviewed studies. So that's risk scores. And then the final slide I have here in the product section is about climate dynamics. So Paul mentioned this a few times. It's something we put in place for our global flood map released back end of last year. And it really is a very flexible framework. When we tried to understand what people wanted in terms of climate options for flood maps about over a year ago now, many different answers were given to us. So we didn't think we could just release a product with a discrete set of climate options. We wanted to give really a range of options. And you can see here the range that's available through our framework. So you can get years out to 2100, to the end of the century, global warming levels out to a 5-degree warming compared to pre-industrial, a whole range of different climate emission scenarios, from the more recent SSPs to the older RCPs to the NGFS, the network for greening the financial system scenarios, which are useful for central banks and regulators. And as Paul mentioned, When we started looking at climate data, it was very clear there's a lot of uncertainty there, and we felt we had to reflect that uncertainty. So we provide estimates of all the metrics I've spoken about, either at the median at the 50th percentile, or anywhere between the 17th and the 83rd percentiles. We chose 17th and 83rd because that 66% range between those is what the IPCC deem as likely, so it made sense to pick that as the range in which we can provide percentiles. And the uncertainty varies a lot depending on where you are and the sort of peril that you're looking at, whether it's fluvial, or coastal. So this gives you insight into the uncertainty brought into our modelling through the climate model ensembles themselves. So hopefully Paul's convinced you about the science, and I've convinced you there's a lot of different options there in the data, and we'll now move on to use cases. And before I get into the three main use cases I want to cover in this webinar, I think it's worth saying that our data lends itself very well to being put into dashboards, to being integrated into automated reports, or to being put into platforms, whether that's an internal platform, maybe an underwriting platform, or whether it's an external platform, maybe a climate analytics platform you want to serve out to your customers. Our data really lends itself well to being integrated into any of these things for a couple of reasons. And one is that there's just a huge range of data and dimensionality there. So you can really pick whatever you want, whether you want all the granularity of a whole load of different return periods for different subperils, or whether you just want one number saying the flood risk is 50 or 65 or whatever. Both of those extremes are possible. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that we have a number of different ways you can access our data, and I'll cover that a bit later on in this webinar, but there are a number of ways, from using our API to using something new we call the Fathom portal, to hosting data on-premise or through partners, and I'll expand on those in a few minutes' time. And all of these integration possibilities are relevant to the next few use cases I'll talk through. So we have people from different verticals licensing our data, be it insurance or engineering or the financial sector or corporate risk managers. There's a number of different people and verticals that license our data. So what I've tried to do is to condense similar use cases down into a coherent set of slides. And this is all about screening, about understanding the risk that a selection of assets might face, and then making a decision based on that information. And so in insurance, which is the area I spent most of my career in, the process of assessing the risk on an asset, on a property or a bunch of properties, and deciding whether to take that risk into your company in the form of an insurance policy, that process is called underwriting. And risk scores, I think, lend themselves very well to underwriting because they pack so much information into one simple metric. If you're in an engineering consultancy, you might be asked to provide a flood risk assessment on 100 locations, but the project budget only gives you enough really to send people out to 10 locations. So what you might want to do is screen those locations, and they're probably looking at our depth layers and looking at the known defended layers would be the most relevant things and useful things to do for the reasons I mentioned earlier in this webinar. You don't want us making the assumptions about flood defences if you can send people out to check on the ground what's actually there. Again, very useful to be able to screen out the highest risk locations and send people to do on-site engineering surveys where it's most effective and most relevant. And if you're an investor looking to invest in real estate, for example, and you're doing due diligence, part of that due diligence could be understanding the flood risk for the real estate asset you're looking to take on, both now and also if it's a long-term hold, how that risk might change in the future using our climate dynamics framework. So a number of use cases, really all a very similar thing, but in different verticals, all about assessing risk and then making a decision based on the assessment of that risk both now and in a future climate. The next use case I want to cover is that of pricing and valuation. And this is a little bit different to just assessing risk and making the decision. It's actually using our information in some sort of numerical calculation in an algorithm. So in the insurance world, this would be a pricing tool, a pricing algorithm, a rating algorithm. So it would take in the information about flood risk. Again, risk scores lend themselves very well to this because they pack so much in to a consistent set of numbers. You'd incorporate risk scores, go into the rating algorithm, and that helps the insurance company calculate the average annual loss, the expected loss, which when loaded up for capital and expenses gives you a technical premium that you can use in your pricing. So that would be the insurance example of this. If you think about a bank with a mortgage book looking to assess default risk or credit risk, again, the information in our US flood map can very easily be put into an algorithm that can help a bank understand actually which properties are most at risk of default because of an increased level of flood risk relative to other properties. So I think pricing and valuation and incorporation into things like credit risk algorithms are a use case for our data. And then the final use case I want to talk about is moving away from individual assets now to thinking about portfolios. So this is where you've got a number of locations, and this could be an insurance portfolio or a reinsurance portfolio, where as a reinsurer, you might have a number of different portfolios, each portfolio representing an insurer that you insure as a reinsurer. Or it might be that you're an investment manager and you have client portfolios, maybe some real estate investment trusts, and you want to see just how sensitive they are, or how exposed they are to flood risk. So a very simple way of doing that, and this is slightly oversimplistic, but hopefully you get the message, is that you can hopefully know where all your locations are. That's pretty important. But if you do, and you know the values at risk in those locations, then you can quite easily put on our risk categories. You could use relative risk, but I've used risk categories in this example, and do just a weighted average of risk category weighted on asset value to get a portfolio risk category number. And then you can plot those on this two-dimensional grid for all your portfolios. So in here, there's portfolio risk category on the x-axis, and there's asset value on the y-axis. So everything that's high risk and high value is top right in the red boxes, and everything that's low risk and low value bottom left. And it gives you maybe another dimension of looking at portfolios. And I think even if you're a reinsurer, where you typically tend to use a cat model, catastrophe model, and we produce cat models in Fathom, but that's a different webinar. I think given the up-to-dateness and the quality of the underlying terrain data and other aspects in this model, this gives you another dimension that probably won't be captured in the cat models you're using if you're a reinsurer. So I think even for a reinsurer, there's value to be had here from knowing which portfolios are more exposed to flood risk compared to others. And if you want to take another step, you could say, okay, how does my balance of portfolio risk shift if you look at a future climate? And so you could look at 2050, maybe SSP 8.5 or something like that, and you could see how the flood risk, how the portfolio risk categories move in different future climate scenarios. So this is a simplistic example, but hopefully you get the idea. This data can be pretty useful for managing portfolios and profiling portfolios. So how do you get hold of this data? Hopefully you're keen to get hold of this data now after everything you've heard so far. Well, there's four main different ways. There's a Fathom API, and I'll talk about that in the next slide in a little bit more detail, because that's new to us and I think pretty interesting, especially when you think about integrating data into platforms. The main advantage there is you don't have to host the large quantities of data, and you've got the full flexibility of our climate dynamics framework available to you through the API. We have a new interactive platform allowing you to visualize data. So if actually getting data and doing calculations on it isn't really your use case, but actually you want to look at it on the map, you want to zoom in, zoom out, pan around, switch on and off layers, then we have a portal, an interactive platform that can enable you to do that. And if you book a demo to view any of our data, we can show you that platform and show you what you can do with that. Obviously, we can give you the data. If you want to hold the data on site, we provide the data as cloud-optimized GeoTIFF files. That's absolutely an option. A couple of things to bear in mind, though. The data is quite large. So if you ask for all our US flood map data with a few climate options, you're absolutely into terabytes of data there. Not necessarily a problem, we can provide that, but something to consider. And you will need to, in that case, if you want it on premise, predefine the climate options you want. We can provide you with any climate options, but you need to tell us what you want so we can generate the data for you. The fourth option, which can sometimes be the quickest option, if you've already got a geospatial platform embedded in your workflows in your business, is to access via a third-party partner platform. I put a few names down there. There's more names on our website. But if you have a geospatial platform embedded in your company and you haven't got our data on it, let them know, let us know. And I'm sure we can get our data onto your platform very quickly. So those are the four main ways of accessing. And I'd just like to touch on the API because it's relatively new to us. We released the API in January this year. We've been improving it and expanding the functionality ever since. And it gives you access to our global data, including the US flood map data for all the perils that we've been talking about, fluvial, and coastal, and with the climate dynamics framework I've spoken about as well. So you've got a lot of flexibility in there. You can access it via REST or via Python SDK, depending on your preference. And there's two main ways of using it. If you want what we call synchronous access, so very quick, very responsive access, this might be for the sort of pricing algorithms where you have to get a price to a customer very quickly. Then you can do that. So we have a synchronous API, gives you sub-second access to data for a point or a polygon very quickly. If, on the other hand, your use case is to assess the risk for large portfolios, millions of locations at a time, we have an asynchronous API that can is still very performant. It can get results to you on millions of points in single-digit minutes. So not sub-second, but very responsive, we think, given the dimensionality of the data and the scope of the data you can ask for through the API. So we have a number of people on the API now using it, and very good feedback on the process of getting onto the API and also the use of the API itself. So that's it from me. I'd just like to close with a few thoughts. We've covered an awful lot in the last 40 minutes or so. So I thought it was just worth summarizing a few of the key points from my perspective. And you saw, going back to the slides Paul showed about our terrain data, you saw just how much the LiDAR data has increased in this 2023 map compared to our 2020 map. It's not very long, just 3 years. And in those 3 years, the amount of area covered by LiDAR has doubled, and the number of buildings has increased from 58% to 94%. And as Paul said, it's even better than that, actually, because even within that 58% of buildings that were covered back in 2020, we've updated the LiDAR data within that 58% as well. So it's actually even better than a doubling, and even better than the figure shown there, because we've brought up to date the 2020 data. For around about half of that 58% actually has been brought up to date by 2023 data. So a massive increase. And what that means is, if you're using a US flood map only 3 years old, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage compared to using this flood map. Or another way, a more positive way of stating that is, if you choose to use our US flood map, you'll be at a competitive advantage. Just by the very nature of time, and not much time at that. But as Paul said, the huge amount of data we have, terrain data, LiDAR data we have, really helps us there. Representation of dams and river channels. These can sometimes be quite technical, maybe sort of in the weeds areas, but really important, as Paul said. If you're trying to model flood risk and get an unbiased view of risk, it's very important these things are represented. All our work's been published in peer-reviewed journals. It either has been or it will be. We've got an ongoing commitment to doing that. It's part of who we are. It's part of why Fathom was formed. And we think that transparency is really important, especially in the field of climate risk analytics. You've got to be very careful that you understand and trust what people do in that field. And we think the transparency we bring through our ethos of publishing is very important there. And the final point I haven't made much on in this webinar is that we do have a dedicated customer success team. So it's all very well and good having great data and great science and a great product, but if we can't explain it to you well and get it to you well and help you integrate and use that data, then we failed. So we do have a dedicated customer success team, really good technical people in that team that understand the data well, understand how you can integrate the data and use the data to help onboard you, to help you start using the data, to help get you going with our US flood map in a really quick and efficient manner. So hopefully that has piqued your interest, and with that I'll pass back to Paul, who will look after the Q&As, and I think there's a poll as well. Paul.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thank you. Yes, so I've been asked by my colleague Anna to say that we're going to run a poll while we're doing the Q&A, and that's just to we want to find out a few things about whether this seminar has been useful, and a few things that you think about it. So there's a poll that could come up. If you could just answer those questions, that'd be really helpful. I mean, and now we'll have a look at the Q&A. You might have noticed I've been answering questions as we go along. I just can't help myself talking about floods, but we can have a look at some of the questions that have been answered. So the first question was, a kind of $64,000 question. Can you do a state in quicker than 6 months? And the answer, the hedged answer is that it depends. What does it depend on? It kind of depends on whether you want to build a complete new statewide model. So Texas wanted a seamless, consistent statewide model, so a brand new model build with their own data in it, and then simulations executed. And that, you know, a reasonable average of had to do that for a whole state is kind of about 6 months. That's not a bad average. Could be a bit more, could be a bit less. Depends on how much new data there is to build into that model, and how much processing and cleanup that data takes to get it into a format that the model is going to be able to read and run with. Kind of depends on the size of the state as well. You know, Texas is a pretty big place, and hydrodynamic computations are expensive. The quicker way to do it is you just take the US data that we've been talking about today, and you just patch it in. So states will have FEMA coverage, but they'll have counties or areas that don't have any maps currently. You could just, for those unmodeled areas or areas beyond you know, small tributaries beyond the extent of the FEMA map, you could simply just take our new US data as is and just patch it in. Of course, you'll get a bit of a bump at the join, but you could smooth those out. There's a GIS technique called feathering that you could use to smooth over any gaps where you're butting up two different data sources together. So you could do this very quickly if you wanted to just patch in the current US data that we've got, or if you wanted to build your own bespoke. If you're a state that wants to build your own bespoke model, then you know that's going to take a little bit of time. You know, these things are complex to do, and you can automate them so much, but it's mostly about the data preparation and then the compute time. Eddie, in the second question, asks, could a state add in their own sea level rise projections? Might differ from those you get from NOAA or USACE. The answer there is yeah. That's exactly what the climate dynamics framework does. It allows you to model any reasonable climate scenario or sea level rise, so different rainfalls, different SSPs, and different projections. And the reason we did that is we realized that, you know, climate modelers update their projections very frequently, and you don't necessarily always want to be rerunning the hydrodynamic model, which takes months and months in order to look at the impact of different climate projections. So instead, we came up with a framework that allows us to run basically a library of simulations and then sample from that library with uncertainty for any particular scenario that you care to put in. So yeah, interrogating the new US data with different climate scenarios is entirely possible, and that's exactly what it was designed to do. It's quite a new feature, really quite cool. There's a question here from, I should let Matt say something about that climate dynamics framework as well, because that's more in his area than mine. So Matt, did I get that right? Is there anything else I should have said about climate dynamics?
No, that was perfect, Paul. The only thing I think I'd add to that is that the NOAA scenarios were mentioned there, and actually the sort of data source underpinning the NOAA scenarios is exactly the same data sources we used for our coastal sea level rise climate dynamics analysis. So that there's a very large amount of consistency there in the underlying data. It was the IPCC 6 assessment review ensemble.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Okay, and Matt, do jump in if I'm going completely off piste or
Will do.
or I'm talking too much, which I will have a tendency to do about this topic. So there's a nice question from Arndt, which is about whether we've worked with FEMA and where FEMA new data should be prioritized. I've got some strong views on this. Basically, I think FEMA should be somehow procuring or creating a national floodwire like Fathoms. It doesn't have to be Fathoms, but I would love it if it were. But you know, other products are available. But I think it's somehow crazy that there are big gaps in the US flood map, when actually we now have these techniques. We can do continental scale models that have real skill, and we can fill in those gaps relatively quickly. And it seemed crazy to me that one doesn't do that kind of thing. So I think, like Texas, you should use methods like this to give a baseline coverage to a country. That's not to say they replace the local modeling studies. No, this is designed to complement those. But if you've got a baseline coverage, at least you can answer those questions about, okay, if we invest X billion or trillion US dollars in climate, in flood defenses, where's that investment best going to go, and what's the bang per buck that we get from that investment? So questions like that can be answered here for the federal government. You know, and I think also those complete comprehensive maps then allow you to prioritize where you're going to invest in better quality models and data. So you get to triage it by risk, essentially. Very nice person asked for a certificate of attendance, and I'm sure we can sort that out, and thanks for the lovely comments. There's an interesting question here about how Fathom's product best differs from others such as First Street Foundations. I mean, it's a model. You know, as I say at the bottom here, all models are wrong. So talking about which models are best is somewhat of a fool's errand. But models differ. Ideally, you'd have a multiple model ensemble and multiple views of risk. That would be the scientifically robust and credible way to do things. But you know, it's obviously people can't go around purchasing, you know, or licensing multiple versions of these things. But scientifically, that's what one would do in climate model. You would have an ensemble. But just on First Street, you know, it's no secret, and you might know that Fathom helped build First Street's original flood model, but we've since stopped working with them, and you know, over time models then diverge, particularly now because we've completely rebuilt our US model from the ground up. So we put, you know, I haven't been keeping up with it. I'm not sure exactly how First Street have developed their model since, but I know that they will have been working on things, and they'll have done their own developments, and so will we. So these models are now going to be a little bit different, and all I can say is that ours has got our latest science in and a very up-to-date view of the data. So we're quite confident that it's a good model. But more than that, really, I can't say, unfortunately. And Alexandra asked about whether we've got initiatives to collaborate or communicate flood hazard to citizens. And we don't. We mostly work business to business, and in many ways that's First Street's one of First Street's you know, USPs, and they do it really well. So, but we don't. We work mostly with businesses and states and NGOs. But we do a lot of press and communicate our work to the public that way as well. So, and I posted a link to an article in the conversation, which we did. I think it's really nice. It's got some super cool maps of some of our results. So it's great. And then just in the last 5 minutes, we've got some open questions, which I'll go to. So Emily asked, how often do you search for LiDAR updates and rerun the model with those? So Matt, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So one of the benefits of Fathom is the extensive research collaborations we have, Emily. So we very often find out about LiDAR sources through those, and actually there's a lot of LiDAR available. It's just really hard to find if you don't have the connections, and we do have those. So research continuously, I'd say, through those sort of research partnership stuff comes up. We don't update the product every time we find some new LiDAR, because there's a sort of sensible time period to change the product. So the frequency of the product update in terms of LiDAR would be roughly every year. We wouldn't look to do it more frequently than that. Obviously, that could change if there's a load of very important LiDAR data that we discovered and we need to put in. We could think about that, but a typical product update frequency would be around about once a year.
Okay, thank you very much. So anonymous attendee asks, have you guys done any work in South Africa? And the answer is, we do work everywhere. We've got a global model at 30-meter resolution. So yes, we've got flood maps of South Africa, and we've got flood maps for everywhere else as well. Have we worked specifically in South Africa? Well, I have in my university research. I've done work in lots of different places across Africa, and I've led very big projects recently, working in Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, and South Africa, and universities there. Yeah, we do research work in South Africa. We have maps of there. Fathom's not done specific work in South Africa, but we're always keen to. And then Kevin McDonald, so which Copernicus DEM does FabDEM use? I was just trying to look that up on the slide because I can't remember the Lawrence Hawker paper. Matt, do you remember off the top of your head which Copernicus DEM FabDEM employs?
Yeah, it's the Glow 30 DEM, isn't it, based on the Tandem X mission, I think, Paul. So I think the underlying resolution is 12 meters. But yeah, it's that one.
I've just looked at the paper and you're dead right. So Kevin, I'm going to put a link to the paper in the Q&A. It's gone into the answer section, but there's a link to Lawrence Hawker's paper on FabDEM there, which has got more than enough detail in there. And we're coming up to the end, and there's only one more question left, and it's a more philosophical one from Hussein, which is, how far are we from open source cat models? Well, now that's a big question. I think some way away is the answer. I mean, cat models are pretty complex beasts to build. We've got experience of doing that at Fathom. They're not straightforward to build. They're not straightforward to use. I think for simple problems, and it's kind of like sort of academic toy models, I think we're close to having those. For example, I'm working with meteorology colleagues on an open cat model for European windstorm, but it works at country level. It is really quite, it's a toy model for scientific experimentation. And I can see us using those things for flood as well. But there's still a few years of, open source cat model of the kind of quality that industry needs and uses. I think we're quite some way away from. Matt, you've been I'm not being rude here by saying you've been around for a while, but you're younger than I am, so I don't know why I'm saying that. But, what do you think? You've been in the industry a while. What do you think about open source cat models?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by open source. So actually, the framework we use, we do have cat models. It's just not the topic of this webinar. But the framework we use for building our cat models is the OASIS loss modeling framework. Now, that's a completely open framework. You can go onto the OASIS LMF website and download the code and build your own open source cat model in a way. So the code base on which you build it is already open source. So in that sense, open source cat models are already there. Although I think from the question, it's more freely available open source models available to everyone, and that's not the case. And I agree with your answer on that, Paul. That will be we're way off that. But from our perspective, the good news is that the transparency that we have in all the science is reflected in our underlying cat model code base, because we use an open source, fully transparent loss modeling framework to build our cat models. So that's one of the reasons we use OASIS as the basis. The other reason is we don't then have to think about building financial models or building our own platform. We can focus all of our development resource into doing good science and producing good products like the one you've seen. Just while I'm talking, Paul, if people want more detail on any of the science in this webinar that we skimmed over because of time, I would very much recommend a webinar we did a week ago. So Oliver Wing, James Savage, and Chris Sampson gave a great, more technical webinar going into more detail on some of the science we've covered in this webinar. Okay.
And I'm just going to answer this very quickly before we finish up, because I'm conscious that we're coming up to the hour. So how would you rate Fathom's channel solver approach versus direct rain on grid 2D? I think you need, there's lots of academic studies which show that unless you have the channel flow in your models, you don't predict wave propagation correctly, because you need a high velocity in the channel, a high velocity filament sitting within a lower velocity floodplain flow, and the momentum exchange between those fast and slow moving areas, the storage on the floodplain, really affects the wave propagation dynamics. So if you don't put channels into your model, you really don't get the correct wave propagation down river channels. Now, I know a lot of places in the US, LiDAR data will get close to channel bed elevation if it's in semi-arid areas. But if you have channel bathymetry that's not captured in the LiDAR data, and that cross-sectional area is will likely be conveying a substantial proportion of the flood flow. I think if you don't include that in your hydrodynamic models, you mispredict the dynamics quite a lot, and I don't think it's a great idea. There's lots of good academic evidence for that. Direct rain on grid 2D approach is great for surface water flooding in urban areas, where you've got the channels correctly captured in the terrain data, but I've got doubts about it from elsewhere. And that's it. I think I'm going to have to draw it to a close. I hope that was interesting and useful. Thank you very much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you again at another Fathom seminar some point in the future. If we haven't answered your questions or you had anything else you wanted to talk to us about, do feel free to connect with us afterwards. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.